remember the mulberry leaves from my childhood, from my home far away. I remember in the springtime the grass sprouted as velvet on the fertile plains of Harpeth, and the mountain streams flowed past our orchard on the outskirts of town. I remember in the springtime the tender mulberry leaves seeking sunlight. But I remember mostly the summer, the dark, green, brooding mulberry leaves and the tasty, ripened berries. One summer stands out as if it were yesterday. The people, their voices, whispering from the past. Every time I touch these mulberry leaves, I think of the Armenians who were killed 7,000 miles away. The seed for this tree came about 80 years ago from Harpeth, a town in Turkey where I was born. For most of my life, I did not know what really happened during the first genocide of the 20th century. My parents merely told me that the mulberry trees had saved my life. How? I did not know. The past was shrouded in fear. What was the real story of the 1.5 million Armenians who had disappeared from Turkey at the beginning of the 20th century?
An ancient people, an ancient land. For 3,000 years, the Armenians had lived at the crossroads of the Middle East. For brief periods, they had their own independent kingdoms. But their land was in the pathway of conquerors, empire builders of the ancient world. Persians, Romans, Arabs, and Turks. Between the 14th and 20th centuries, the Christian Armenians lived as a subject people in the Ottoman Empire under fierce Turkish domination. In the late 19th century, oppression of the Armenians increased. Periodic massacres took place. No family would be left untouched. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling in the 19th century. By 1914, the Serbs, Bulgarians, and Albanians fought their Turkish overlords and established independent nation-states. With the loss of territories in Europe during the Balkan Wars, Turkish leaders turned eastward, with dreams of a vast ethnic empire extending to Central Asia. But one group stood in the direct path of Turkish plans: the Armenians. Under the cover of the First World War, Turkish rulers attempted to unify the Turkic people. They inflamed religious differences and embarked on a policy of deportation and genocide. The city of Harpeth stood high on a vast plateau near a beautiful lake. The legendary Tigris River of Mesopotamia originated within the outskirts of Harpeth, and the mighty Euphrates gathered its force from the Harpeth plain. For centuries, the region has served as a granary for empires and a passage for invaders. Harpeth was once part of an ancient Armenian kingdom on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. Here was the site of an ancient fort built a millennium before Christ. Here, man first used metal tools 9,000 years ago. Now it is a place of ruins and windswept barren walls. Once, over 2 million Armenians lived in Turkey. 150,000 of them lived in Harpert and the neighboring countryside. Today, there are none. Centrally located in what is now eastern Turkey, Harpert stood at the crossroads of trade and commerce. In 1915, it became a focal point in the extermination of the Armenians. The filmmaker, J. Michael Hagopian, was born in one of the large dwellings on this busy street. Here as a boy, he first became aware of the tensions between the Turks and Armenians. Mezre, the main business quarter of the Harpert area, was the capital of the province, known in Turkish as a vilayet. The government house and the police station were on the main street. On the same street lived the governor of the province, called the Vali, and 5 wealthy Armenian manufacturing brothers, known as the Fabrikatorians. Their elegant homes next to each other were admired by Turks and Armenians alike. They operated a large textile mill, producing fine silk and cotton cloth. Many farming villages ringed Harpert and Mezre. Grapes for wine, mulberries for silk. Because of its productivity, the area was known as the Golden Plain of Harpert. The area was populated with Armenians, Turks, and Kurds, a Muslim people living mostly in the mountains. The distance between Mezre and Harpert was only 3 miles. Armenians referred to the whole area as Harpert. Americans and Europeans called it Harput. Among the Armenians who lived in town were many professionals, businessmen and teachers. The Armenians were also the chief craftsmen and artisans of the region. They were the economic backbone of the community. Their progress was often a cause of envy among the Turks. Their Christian faith was a matter of scorn. But no one knew then how drastically their world was to change.
Amazingly, I found this photograph of my parents in the attic of a missionary family in Rhode Island after 20 years of research. My father, affectionately known as Dr. Mikhail, was the chief of surgery in an American hospital in Harpert. My parents were the only known survivors of the genocide of those who were photographed together that summer afternoon in 1914.
Who saw, who heard what happened besides the Armenians? The voices of 5 people from Western Europe and America have emerged as key eyewitnesses to what happened in Harpert in 1915. Marie Jacobsen of Denmark came to Harpert as an educator. She kept a detailed diary of the genocide. Mrs. Tacy Atkinson, an American medical missionary, kept one of 2 known journals of events of the genocide in the Harpert area. Another witness was her husband, Dr. Herbert Atkinson, the director of the American hospital. Johannes Ehmann, a German Protestant missionary, was the 4th eyewitness. He had come to the Harpert area in 1897 to direct an orphanage for Armenian children, whose families had been killed in massacres in the 1890s. United States Consul Leslie Davis was the 5th eyewitness from the West. He was the only American official in the interior of Turkey at that time. Garbed Bedrosian was the interpreter and bodyguard of the American consul. He was to play a key role in solving the disappearance of the Armenians. He and other Armenian survivors corroborated the 5 foreign witnesses who were residents of Harpert. The original purpose of the missionaries was to convert the Turks and other Muslims. They failed in this attempt, but the Armenians, who had become Christians 15 centuries earlier, found much in common with the missionaries. In 1878, the Congregational Missionaries established a college in Harpert, first called Armenia College. Under Turkish protest, it was renamed Euphrates College. Most of the faculty and students were Armenian. The missionaries in Harpert were from different countries, but they had a special bond. They often held social gatherings for the college and the hospital staff, and for diplomatic personnel and visitors. For the missionaries, it was a good life. For the Armenians, it was the calm before the storm.
So we had picnics, long, just incredible number of people. We'd go up into the mountains, we'd dig a hole and put this huge crock with all types of vegetables and meats and so on, and cook it semi-underground. And all through the day, people would eat meze, it's called, hors d'oeuvres, drinking raki, and we dance on oriental rugs, and then certain groups of people would be in one place, and then other groups would be in a hill next to it and so on. And at night we would start singing some Armenian songs that would be, we would sing certain stanzas of it, and groups in the other mountain would echo and sing the second verses, etc.
Sometimes the missionaries made trips to the banks of the Euphrates and to nearby Lake Goljuk. Harpert was ideally situated as a recreational area. The Euphrates River curved around the city some 10 miles away, and Lake Goljuk was only 20 miles to the south. Both the river and the lake were to play a critical role in the destiny of the Armenian people.
The San Joaquin River in Central California reminded my parents of the 2 rivers of Armenia. I tried to imagine what it was like that summer in 1915, the silent river, distant cries of anguish. I used to play in the mulberry groves. Now I try to decipher the past and give it meaning. As a boy growing up in Fresno, I never realized the significance of the term Goljuk. My family had vacations there. Years later, I remember my parents picnicking on the banks of the San Joaquin River, talking about Goljuk, Goljuk, Goljuk. Sometimes their hearts were light as they reminisced about the beauty of this lake. But most often, father and mother spoke in hushed tones, with a terror in their voice I could never understand.
used to go camping up by Lake Gurjik in the summertime, up under the mulberry trees. My father and Dr. Shepherd would often meet up there and spend hours playing chess. They would put up a camp stool between them, and they would study out those moves in chess and play chess by the hours. It was a lovely place overlooking the lake, and there was a lovely beach there where we used to go swimming. And it was out underneath the mulberry trees. We used to eat the mulberries as fast as we could pick them. We had a good time under the trees. My mother wrote down things. She didn't write them every day. She just wrote them as they happened once in a while. But she did record a lot of what happened and what she saw and experienced, and put them in her diary, along with a lot of the material that she wanted to remember about us children while we were little.
My parents knew the Atkinsons. They were our neighbors. But until I found her journal, none of us knew that Tacy Atkinson was keeping a secret record, one which could have exposed her to the Turkish authorities.
The first entry by Mrs. Atkinson about the Armenian genocide was on May 2nd, 1915.
May 2nd, several professors put in prison.
The Atkinsons observed the tragedy that was unfolding from the vantage point of the house they had built. Mrs. Atkinson had personally designed the building and had done a great deal of the carpentry herself. She would often sit by the window to sort out what was happening in the street below. Marie Jacobsen, the Danish missionary, was also keeping a diary. On May 1st, a day before Mrs. Atkinson's entry, Marie Jacobsen, writing in Danish, recorded the same events in her journal.
Der var megen uro i Harput. Flere butikker og private huse blev undersøgte og lukkede. There was a lot of disturbance in Harput. 3 of our professors and the teacher were fetched or picked up by soldiers and brought to the government building. A little later they were brought to their houses again, where they were while their houses were being searched. Any piece of paper with something written on was taken. All the men were put in jail. Everyone is scared and expect a massacre. May 4th. People are in great fear. Everyone says it's all being done according to a plan, and it's a certain beginning of a massacre.
The German missionary Johannes Iman, the director of the Armenian orphanage, could see the danger to Armenians.
On May 5th, Johannes Iman addressed the situation in Harput in a letter to the German ambassador in Constantinople, Freiherr Hans von Wangenheim. He wrote, "For a few days, strict house searches are conducted in the Christian houses in the town and its surroundings. People who appear suspicious to the government are arrested and the people are ordered to give up their arms."
Before our men were destroyed in the prisons, the Turks sent out messages that if the wives of these men would turn in all the guns. They would release their husbands from the prisons. And Reverend Lamerkhanian spoke from the pulpit one day saying that if the women would turn in their guns, that the Turks would release their husbands. Whereupon Mr. Henry Riggs, the missionary, who was head of the colleges there, got up and said, if I were you, even if you don't have guns, buy them and turn them in. So many of the women bought guns and turned them to the government. Immediately, a message went to Constantinople saying that they had confiscated 1,000 guns from the Armenians who were rising against them. Consequently, they kept pushing that around, that we were rising against the Turks, which we were not. Those guns were turned in, were bought and turned in to have the husbands released. Instead of releasing the husbands, they murdered them and butchered them during the night and buried them in a big grave outside of the city. And
Did you hear Lamerkhanian yourself?
yes. And then, of course, the men were all butchered, and then they began to take the women down the hill and kill them, butchered them also.
In June 1915, there was unusual military activity in the civilian areas of Harpert. The American consulate in Harpert realized that the Turkish government was falsely accusing the Armenians of hiding arms. Consul Davis, one of the key eyewitnesses, alerted Washington about the peril that the Armenians faced. Caleb Davis later found his father's original documents. He saw that they authenticated the testimonies given by the other witnesses. Some of Davis's reports were censored by the Turkish government and never reached the United States.
I think it's probable that in many cases the bombs, which were found in the backyards of the persons accused, were actually buried there by the police so as to manufacture evidence against the Armenians. It is certain, however, that many of the people who surrendered some kind of a weapon were never engaged in any revolutionary plot, and that there was not even so much as evidence against many of them who were tortured.
Now began tortures to make them confess to having bombs. Before this time, all Armenians had been told to give up their arms, and many had done so. Now they began to torture to make them tell where their arms are hidden.
On June 18, Johannes Ehemann sent an urgent telegram to the German embassy. The Christians have given up their arms, and makes it clear that any allegation that the local Armenians would be in rebellion against the government are completely unbased.
Well, Professor Vorperian was taken in with all the intelligentsia to the prisons, and he was not tortured, but he was made to sit on a stool there and watch as they tortured the other professors and teachers and doctors, while they did some horrible, very horrible things to them, like putting a red-hot metal pan on top of one professor's head, and pulled his nails out with pliers. They put their hands and feet in the vise and pull their nails and toenails out. And they would hang them upside down in the toilet, which was an outhouse, until their head touched the filth. And then they would slice the bottoms of their feet and put salt on them. And they would torture and torture all the professors. With one professor, Tanikejan, who was the head of the Armenian group in Harpert, they pulled his eyes out and sent it to his family. And Vorperian lost his mind. they released him and sent him to his home. And his home was just half a block from where we lived. We could watch him. He would run out of the house in the nude, and he would scream, "Oh, God, they did it again. Oh, God, help them, they did it again. Help, help, help." He'd scream. And then his family would run out with sheets and bedspreads after him and cover him up and take him in. This took place for about a month until finally he died.
It was a time of treachery and deceit. Armenians had endured persecution and massacres before. Now, something more sinister was going on. Parents kept their children at home. Families were governed by fear. Living not far away from the Atkinsons were the Hagopians, Dr. Mikhail and his wife. During the night of June 22nd, Ahavni Hagopian was startled by frantic pounding on the door. Her infant son started to cry in his cradle. In his study, Dr. Mikhail was entering notations in his journal. This night, he feared the Turkish police had come to arrest and imprison him under the cover of darkness. In fact, Dr. Mikhail had been summoned to the governor's home to perform emergency surgery on a Turkish chieftain. Mrs. Hagopian feared for her husband's life. Her eyes were on the street below, and she saw many of her husband's friends who had been tortured in prison. They were being carried away in garbage carts. She was certain he was among them.
They took a large group that had been in prison for several days. They took them at night in garbage carts. Through the window, I saw them by the light of the moon. They made the able-bodied walk and put the old ones in the garbage carts.
The Armenians deported this night became known as the Group of 800, the first of many groups forced on a death march. The next morning, Mrs. Atkinson entered in her diary, independently, what Mrs. Hagopian had witnessed the night before.
June 23rd. In the morning, we were stunned by the news that all the prisoners were quietly sent out, bound, in the night. Among them were many, in fact, most of the leaders among the Armenians. About this time, warnings from friendly Turks and Kurds were whispered to us that a massacre was planned within 10 days.
American Consul Leslie Davis confirmed what the others had reported. All presumed that the 800 had been killed.
In his report to the State Department, my father, Consul Davis, wrote as follows. On the night of June 23, 1915, several hundred of the most prominent Armenians were sent away in ox carts from the local prison to an unknown destination. Among them were the bishop of the Armenian Gregorian Church, most of the professors and instructors in Euphrates College, and many of the leading merchants and professional men in Harput.
3 days later, Iman again contacted his government. He was concerned about the German failure to act on the atrocities.
Iman sent another urgent telegram. After all of the last time, the deportation of the whole Christian population of the town and land has been ordered without distinction.
On Saturday afternoon, June the 26th, we were all startled by the announcement that the Turkish government had ordered the deportation of every Armenian. Some of the missionaries decided they would like to go with them in order to be of assistance to those who might need help. I called on the Vali about this and other matters. This request he refused absolutely, but that after the people reached their destination, the Americans might then join them if they wished.
June 27, Ehman sent another telegram, this time in French, so that it would go fast through Turkish censorship. He wrote, "The Governor-General told me that the order to deport applies to all Armenian subjects of this province without distinction. I beg Your Excellency to make the necessary interventions because the order of deportation will be enforced after 3 days."
Consul Davis saved many Armenians. He used to have banquets for Turkish officers. The Vali, the Khay Makam, and higher position Turks. He used to give great big dinners to them. And he was very friendly with them. So he could talk to them sometimes for Armenians, not to bother them. And all these people who used to go hide in the attic. Nobody should talk, nobody should move, so nobody will know that there's so many Armenians in the American consulate.
Among those hiding in the consulate were relatives of Garabed Bedrosian, Consul Davis's translator and Armenian bodyguard.
While these people were hiding in the consulate, the Turks were holding prayer meetings every night in the square in front of it, and we could all hear them piously calling upon Allah to bless them in their efforts to kill the hated Christians. Night after night, this same chant went up to heaven, and day after day, these Turks carried on their bloody work.
July 10th. This afternoon, the Delal went through the streets crying out that on Tuesday, every Armenian is to go without exception.
It has just been announced by the public crier that on Tuesday, July 13th, every Armenian, without exception, must go.
Not every Armenian did go. Some hid, a few escaped. Garbed Dermanasyan was one of them. He was one of the 800 deported during the night of June 22nd. At his farm near Fresno, California, he recalled the horrors of that day, long repressed, never forgotten.
When we heard the town cry, calling us all, the town was surrounded by the gendarme and the authorities of the Turkish. Then get ready, tell us to get ready, pack what we can find for food or clothing, anything that we can carry, and we have to leave our homes and go away.
Before taking them out, they would come and write Sofket on everybody's door. That meant exile, which meant that the following day they were going to be taken out, and everybody had to be ready. Of course, they had everybody sell their belongings. We took our 11-room house, emptied all the rooms and took them all down. And the auctioneer came and sold everything. We got $45 out of the whole 11-room house furnishings, and about 3 donkeys. And the Turks took 2 donkeys away from us. That left us with 1. First, the wealthy families were taken down. When we tried to go down with them, my father's friend, Bahaj Effendi, he felt very responsible for us, so he sent word for us not to go.
Some Turks, like Bahaj Effendi, were friendly. Others saved Armenian lives, like the director of Harpert's Red Cross, called the Red Crescent in Turkey.
The Mudir of the Red Crescent called here today. He is one Turk who feels dreadful about these things. He has 600 in his hospital of these poor exiles. They will not give him workers to care for them. He is truly doing his best. He says that 1.5 million of Armenians have been killed these last few weeks.
In this same period, the Turkish Governor-General of Harpert province received a telegram from Behedin Shakir, chief of a special organization, a political unit in charge of deporting the Armenians. The telegram demanded to know if the responsible local official was performing his task well. The telegram read, "Are the Armenians who are being deported from your area being liquidated? Are the harmful people who you say are being banished and dispersed being destroyed, or are they being merely removed and sent away?" Harpert's central location on the Armenian plateau made for an efficient gathering center for those marked for death. During the summer of 1915, Armenians from every part of the Ottoman Empire were being deported and killed by the Turks. On their forced march to the Syrian desert, many deportees passed through Harpert. Working closely with the military, Turkish civilians would wait along the roadside outside of Harpert to rob and massacre the Armenians.
Turkish men and officials were looking at the children, especially the little girls, and choosing the best-looking ones, and we saw them one by one being led away to Turkish harems, which means a life of slavery.
Mothers offer their children and beg one to take them. The Turks have been taking their choice of these children and the girls for slaves or worse. In fact, they have even had their doctors there to examine more likely girls and thus secure the best ones.
Consul Davis was horrified that some Armenian mothers who were about to be massacred would give up a child to be saved by a Turk. For this reason, he acquired a degree of contempt for the Armenians. Yet the life of every Armenian child hung in the balance: death march or slavery.
Somehow I got away from my mother's babysitter, Koharig Demirjian. And I saw Mother and someone else come running down the front steps of the hospital, and they turned and went to the back gate of the compound. I followed along, and they didn't know I was following them. And I saw people being driven at the point of the bayonet down past the hospital compound. And there was a soldier on horseback, and she went over and grabbed him by the ankle and said something to him. I don't know what she said. And the other soldier came up and took her by the arm and said, "We'll take you along too." And I was so glad they didn't take Mother too. But the others were taken and they were killed.
The real goal of the deportation was to eliminate the Armenians through exhaustion, starvation, and massacre.
My mother was holding my hand. We were being deported. We walked and walked. Within an hour, we saw the bodies of the killed people rotting under the sun. I was terribly afraid. I held my nose from the horrible odor and closed my eyes so I could not see. We walked, 50 of us, my mother holding my hand, from the mountains of Harper to the wilderness of Syria.
Throughout the summer of 1915, caravan after caravan left Harpert on forced death marches towards the desert. The official explanation was that the Armenians were being relocated to a safe zone. News filtered back slowly about what happened to the 800, the first group to leave. A nation was disappearing in the folds of these rugged mountains. Marie Jacobson recorded the details in her diary.
Terrible things are happening again today in Harput. Soldiers have encircled the town, tried to imprison all men and boys over 13 years. About 800 prisoners were sent off early in the morning before people were up. They were all tied together. When they came to the other side of Kankia, they were led away from the road over the mountain to a valley. Here they were ordered to sit down and rest. When they were taken away from the road, they all knew they were going to be killed.
They make us walk down through the hills instead of roads and climb up to the wilderness, wherever the thick woods and mountains was coming. So would they make us walk 4 days? And finally we arrived into a valley, which was big high hills, 3 sides, and one side was just a few trees and some rainwater was running down, you know. So they asked us to sit down. Everybody sat down, tried to eat and get some water from the dish to drink.
Towards evening, orders were given to the soldiers to start shooting, and bullets flew around them.
Before we started, I ate a little bit, all of a sudden we heard gunshots in the air. Then just see from all over, from 3 sides and 4 sides, all this mob running through, hollering and swinging swords and clubs and metal, anything they had in their hands. And started first taking all the clothes and asking for money and jewelry and everything and pushing people around.
But they ran out of bullets before they had everyone killed. So now they began to chop loose with the little axes they carry in their belts and with bayonets.
The gendarmes came and picked up all the boys between 5 and 10 years old, threw us into a pile. And I happened to be one of the first ones, and I was at the bottom of the pile. After they had all the boys in this pile, they started with their swords and bayonets killing us boys. And one of the bayonets just hit me in my right cheek here, and the blood was streaming, not only the blood from my cheek, but the blood from those dead boys, that hot blood coming all over me, and I couldn't scream or I couldn't cry for fear that they would finish the job and kill me again.
They knocked me on the head. I fell down. I don't remember what happened after that. Then when I wake up at midnight, I don't know what the time really was, but approximately, but only I see a moonlight that shine all over. thousands of people dead over there. And just bull shot out of their face, and some of them without clothes, without anything. Then I heard my father messed up cold. My mother was still alive. So he had her head on her lap, and Father said, Mom wants some water. So I looked around and found some broken dish or something, ran down and got some water and put it in their mouth.
Suddenly, this man felt that a rope with which he was bound was loose, and he jumped up and ran, and with him about some 30 others, but most of them were caught and shot. Our friend ran and ran, and he didn't know where.
The reason we found out that those men and boys were being speared and thrown into the trenches was when the young boys, 14, 15 years old, who hadn't been killed, they would dig themselves out of the trenches and come to the town holding their guts hanging out of their bellies because the spears had made holes there and the guts would be hanging out.
We have a very much more authentic report of the 800 just described, but I dare not write it now.
Fearful of the Turks, Mrs. Atkinson carefully scratched out the massacre reference from her diary. Among those who disappeared during the night of June 22nd were college students, professors, artists, musicians, and writers. Most of the Armenian leadership of Harpert was silenced forever. The 5 Fabrikatorian brothers were among those massacred. Their textile factory was destroyed, leaving even the Turkish military without uniforms. The group of Armenians driven out of their homes on the night of June 22, 1915, had been sent to a secret destination. For months, the public did not know where they were exiled, or if they were even alive. A mystery shrouded their disappearance. Those who remained wondered, if the Armenians were being deported to a safe zone, why weren't the Turks also included? Why was it done secretly? The answers to these questions were never clarified by the Turkish authorities in Constantinople. As allies with Germany in the First World War, the Turks had assured the Germans that there was no general order to deport Armenians. On July 17th, a frustrated Johannes Iman wrote again to the German ambassador in Constantinople, disputing this view.
He said that exactly the opposite had happened, that 2 weeks, that is, on the 3rd of July, the general deportation had started in Harpert, and because of the consequences and the fait accompli achieved by the Turkish government, there was not much left to be done.
July 24, the town crier today called from the mosques and around the streets that a Turk who hides an Armenian will be hung and his house will be burnt.
At that time, we were living next door to a friendly Turkish family. Father trusted our neighbor, but he suspected the motives of the government. Twice our family was threatened with deportation. Twice the order was lifted. My father knew it was only a matter of time before we would have to go. He looked to the hills just outside of town.
The Hagopian home was 4 miles from the American hospital. Dr. Mikhail worked there. On the left side was the German orphanage. Dr. Mikhail's farm was as big as the German grounds. The garden was pretty large. There were mulberry trees, apple trees, everything was there.
Finally, the Vali, the governor, notified my father that he was going to deport our family with what he called a good caravan to have a safe journey. Father knew no one returned from their safe journeys. My parents were torn. I would be killed if I went on the caravan. I might die if they left me behind. Life went on as usual for the Turks, but for the Armenians, death seemed certain just outside of town. On the way to Lake Goljuk, my father had an orchard. It was 10 acres in size and was surrounded by high walls. I remember the mulberry grove. It was hidden by a line of tall poplars. The mulberry trees were planted as a wedding gift to my mother. Now, my father thought this would make a good hiding place for me. He carried me to the middle of the grove, to a dry well. To save my life, he placed me down in it, hoping that the Turks would not find me, and that by a miracle I would survive. He had great faith in Providence. Time had run out. My parents were ordered to the caravan. I was hidden under the leaves. The mulberry trees shielded the well, or what could have been my grave. I will never know, because during that last night, another high Turkish official got sick. The Turks needed a doctor, my father. My mother ran to the grove. I was taken out of the well.
I'm looking at pictures and papers and documents that my father, Garbed Bedrosian, brought with him when he left Turkey in 1922. When he was in Turkey, he was the bodyguard, that is the Havas, of the American consul, and he traveled with the American consul all over the countryside, and he had a great opportunity to observe and to view all of the atrocities, and he worked for the American government about 17 years.
As the American consul to Harput, my father was the only representative of a foreign or neutral nation in that deep interior section of Turkey during the First World War. And as he says in the book, he was not particularly fond of the Armenians, but he reported the facts as he saw them. And he even, at some risk to himself, helped them out by sheltering them at the consulate and taking care of some of their financial problems and protecting them from the brutality of the Turks.
In looking over my father's papers, I came across these many pages of lists of names with amounts of money shown next to them, and these represent monies that were given to Consul Davis to keep for these people who did not know what was going to happen to them. Their belongings had been confiscated, and they were going to be exiled from their villages, and they gave these monies to the consul for him to keep for them and to return it to them sometime later if that was possible. If not, they were to give it to relatives in America, and on some of these they had given their addresses. For example, we have one here that says, Garabed Gohusyan, $55, deposited on the account of Leslie A. Davis, and so on. And the list, you can see so many names. And then on this front page, there are the addresses of the relatives in the United States.
One day in mid-September, the Turkish bodyguard of Consul Davis confided to Havas Garbed that he knew where the killing grounds were outside of Harpert. Secretly, under the cover of darkness, the consul and his Armenian bodyguard went out to find the missing 800. Meanwhile, on September 18th, the Turkish governor replied to the inquiry he had received earlier from the Special Organization Chief by saying that the job was well done, that 51,000 Armenians had been deported. No mention was made of any killings.
September 24. Consul took a ride to Goljuk. He says that beginning 1.5 hours from here, he began seeing dead bodies, and all along every few yards, mostly women and children. In the lake there were many, and even at our camping place, there were several washed up.
Consul Davis and Havas Garabet, they went way to Goljuk. And when they went there, they saw thousands of bodies, all naked. The Kurds take all their clothes and then kill them. And it was such a horrible sight that they were shaken. And my brother-in-law, after they came back, he says how God could allow such a thing happen. Little children, men and women, they were all slaughtered. And this shook his faith. It took many years later to get his faith back.
A few weeks later, Dr. Atkinson of the American Hospital expressed a desire to make this trip with me. We decided to make a complete tour of the lake this time in order to see what there might be on the other side. We started about 3 o'clock in the morning, one day in the latter part of October. After leaving the village of the Kurds, we climbed a very steep mountain and then descended into the valley on Lake Goljuk.
Lake Goljuk was a day's journey on foot from Harpert. On opposite shores of the lake were 2 villages, one inhabited by Kurds, the other by Armenians. Khacho Khachadurian, a boy of 13 in 1915, lived in the Armenian village. His father was a boat builder and often took people on sightseeing trips. To the end of his life, Khacho would sing the songs of the lake he'd learned as a youth, helping his father. When Turkish troops appeared in the countryside, Khacho's mother knew that deportation and certain death were at hand. Death march or slavery. To save her sons, she decided to give them to a friendly Kurd, knowing her children would be forced to give up their Armenian identity.
My uncle asked me to come over to him, and he said, "Khachadur, my son, you are going to a foreign home. Do not forget your Christian faith. Do not forget your reading and writing. Here, I'm giving you paper, pen, and pencil. Write what happens to you."
Faithful to his uncle, Khacho wrote what he witnessed at the lake. After Khacho died in 1980, his wife found the original draft of his memoirs about his life as a boy on the shores of Lake Goljuk.
We wept bitter tears when we said goodbye to Mother. She said, "Khacho, take care of your little brother." We were leaving behind our loved ones, our relatives, and our playmates. We were close to the Kurd village when suddenly we became terribly homesick. My brother and I ran back to our village, hoping to see our loved ones again. To our sorrow, there was no one there. The Turks had rounded up everybody. We saw them in the distance, climbing a hill. The gendarmes were forcing them along. Our village was empty. Only hungry dogs roamed the streets.
In 1918, Consul Davis sent a report to the U.S. State Department recounting his visit to Hacho's deserted village. The Davis report was declassified in 1987, years after Hacho wrote the same version of the facts. The consul said when he arrived at the village he found not a single inhabitant remained. It was absolutely deserted, except for a few hungry cats.
My father told me this story one day, and I have never forgotten it. He and Consul Davis were riding their horses on a trip along the Goljug, and as they came up to it, they saw this big book floating in the water. And immediately, my father dismounted from his horse, and he went into the lake and retrieved this big book, and it was dripping with water, but it was still intact. And as he brought it out, he realized that it was the Bible, and that really touched him. And he brought it out and dried the leaves, the pages, as best he could.
We rode along the lake for about 2 hours. The banks of the lake for most of this distance are high and steep, while at the frequent intervals there are deep valleys. In some of the valleys, there were only a few bodies, but in others there were more than 1,000. We estimated that there were no less than 2,000 in that one valley. Many of them were right on the edge of the lake, and their heads showed above the sand. The valley was large, and the bodies were strewn all over it. The bodies were all naked. All right, we estimated that in the course of our ride around the lake, and actually within the space of 24 hours, we had seen the remains of no less than 10,000 Armenians who had been killed around Lake Goljug. Few localities could be better suited to the fiendish purposes of the Turks in their plan to exterminate the Armenian population than this peaceful lake in the interior of Asiatic Turkey.
Throughout the summer and autumn of 1915, the government continued its policy of genocide. Even more people were massacred at the lake, until Harpert was almost depleted of Armenians. Soldier and civilian Turks participated in the atrocities. Many Kurds helped Armenians escape. More often, though, Kurds were incited by the government to plunder and massacre the Armenians.
Great flocks of Kurds have come to town today, and people are now again full of fear for what's going to happen. They themselves say they have been fetched by the Turks to come and finish off the rest of the Armenians. A number of them were sent to Goljug with some cannons in order to bombard the little island out in the lake, where it's said that a number of Armenians are hidden.
Some of the Armenians who swam to safety, to the island in Lake Goljug, were village friends of Hacho Khachaturian. Hacho remembered the day well. He made a list of the young men and one woman who had fled to the island.
Haruchun Narvaryan, Hovannes Najarian, Shahbaz Varsabedian, Haruchun Mardigian, Orior Sultan Der Margozian.
Hacho was now an orphan, a slave, working under his new Kurdish master, Bekir.
Ես ալնում վայրերում մեջ կարնուկները գարացեի։
I was herding sheep in the same ravine.
Մուխմը գպարսանար։
Bekir walked up to me, and with a happy look on his face, he said, "Hacho, Look how the Turkish soldiers are burning the rebellious infidel Armenians. I looked toward the island where the little church was burning.
By the autumn of 1915, Harpert was a dismal place. The sword of terror had touched everyone. The missionaries were helpless, physically shaken by the inhuman horrors they had witnessed.
And they found all the ravines and all filled with dead bodies. Many of those people, Father had worked hard in the hospital to give them life and sustenance, and now they were gone. And it really did a drastic job on Father. They just understood what it was the Lord had brought them to Turkey for, and it was quite a hardship for them to see that. There were some 10,000 bodies that they saw up there by Lake Guljuk that Father, it just undid him completely.
November 25, Thanksgiving. We have it here this year. I knew that folks would not stay till after dark, so we had service at 11:30 and dinner at 1. 17 at table, including 2 Danes and little Bessie, an Armenian, and an American woman and her little boy who was stranded here sick. Her husband, an Armenian, was killed. All of us, amidst the hard things we have, are truly grateful to be alive. After dinner was the usual weighings. Herbert, 178, I, 120, Henry, 84, Alice, 50, Harriet, 40. All went home before dark.
Soon after Thanksgiving, Dr. Atkinson caught the dreaded typhus disease. Weak and broken-hearted, he wondered why God had permitted such atrocities, such cruelty. On his deathbed, Dr. Atkinson and his physician, Dr. Mikhail Hagopian, said a prayer together.
He smiled when he saw me, took my hand, pulled me down, patted my cheek, ran his fingers through my short hair. Then with the forefinger of the other hand, he pointed upward. I knew he was trying to tell me he was going. A little later, he said to me, I am going to die on Sunday. I asked him how he knew, and he said he had measured his strength, and he thought he had that much, but no more. He said his work was finished. He had felt that God had sent him here just for the work he has done this summer. At 2:25 on Christmas, the breath stopped.
In 1917, the United States severed diplomatic relations with Turkey. Mrs. Atkinson and her 3 children returned to America. She left her diary behind with her furniture, for fear the Turks would discover it on her person. 8 years after she left Turkey, Tacy Atkinson's diary finally arrived in the United States, hidden in her living room sofa. No longer fearful of Turkish censorship, she made a final entry in 1924 about what her husband witnessed at Lake Guljuk.
1924. The story of this trip I did not dare to write. They saw about 10,000 bodies.
Tacey Atkinson died in 1967, carrying to the grave the secret of her scratched-out diary. With the help of digital technology, we were finally able to decipher the words only her eyes had seen in 1915. She wrote about the German missionary Johannes Ehmann, whose appeals to save Armenians were never addressed by his own government.
Among the Turks and Armenians both, it seems pretty well known that this thing is from the Germans. Even Mr. Ehmann himself is coming to the conviction that it is the work of his own government. We all know such clear-cut, well-planned, all well-carried-out work is not the method of the Turk.
The United States entered the First World War in 1917 against Germany, Turkey's ally. The American consulate in Harpert was closed, and Consul Davis was reassigned to Finland.
My father, my mother, and myself and my sister, Khatun, we were living in the American consulate. That was our home. When the consul left, he told Chavas Garabet, his bodyguard, to get all the films, all those negatives, and put in an earthen jar and bury it. So they dig a great big hole down behind the stable in the American consulate and put the jar in there and covered it. I was standing right there too. I can remember the place and everything.
In 1922, Chavas Garabed was allowed to leave Turkey with his family. He hid Consul Davis's photos of Lake Goljuk in the tattered clothing of the orphans accompanying him. Once out of Turkey, he corresponded with Leslie Davis through an address in Marseille, France, and delivered the photographs to the consul in Finland. For 50 years, Chavas Garabed would not speak about what he had seen at the lake. Before his death in February 1977, at the age of 94, he finally told his family what he had witnessed.
That's
the voice of Garabed Bedrosian. I was there when they make it.
The photographs of Consul Davis had remained buried in an earthen jar for 8 years. For over 70 years, the aging negatives were neglected. They had been forgotten by the Davis family and had been hidden to the world. Most were destroyed by weather and moisture. The few which survive attest to an unspeakable carnage around the shores of Lake Goljuk and elsewhere in the province of Harpert. After almost a century, the words of Consul Leslie Davis ring from the blood-stained earth of Harpert.
That which took place around the beautiful Lake Goljuk in the summer of 1915 is almost inconceivable. Thousands and thousands of Armenians, mostly innocent and helpless women and children, were butchered on its shores and barbarously mutilated. There were fully 150,000 Armenians in the vilayet prior to 1915. At the end of that year, there remained only 8,000 or 10,000. This may well be called the slaughterhouse vilayet of Turkey.
Armenian voices are now silent, but they still echo at the headwaters of the Tigris River. The bodies, long since, have floated down the nearby Euphrates. The water is clear, the lake peaceful, as if for all eternity.
It was only a lifetime ago. This lake, this city, this land had witnessed the most tragic and momentous event in Armenian history. A civilization lay dead under the mulberry trees. Within the lifespan of one mulberry leaf, the community had vanished. My family escaped and sought a land of freedom. We arrived in America in 1923, but left behind us a lost world. I remember my mother saying, Galilee Yogurtma Panachanchel, by their big Galilee Che, Zain Laretzanel. You can kill a people, but their voices will never die.